with families in your field, individuals in your field, and how do you kind of combat those challenges?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges sometimes prevents people from even coming. There can be a stigma still associated with reaching out for counseling services. And what we know is the death of a significant person or dealing with end of life with someone that we love and care about, it can overwhelm our usual coping tools. And so even though grief and the mourning process that we go through is natural and expected, it can overwhelm our usual coping. And so it can be brave and courageous to reach out and ask for help, because we're not always so good at asking for help. So sometimes that's a challenge to even getting someone to come in. And then I think once they're here, they realize that this time that they spend in counseling, whether it's individual, family, or one of our groups, is really for them to share what's going on with them and to learn about grief and mourning. I think that's one of the other challenges, is that, or another challenge, is that there are some myths about grief, and just kind of, I think, myths about end of life too. That grief, people sometimes think that it's supposed to happen one certain way. The 5 stages of grief is something that people often hear about. It's in movies and sitcoms and in media, and so they think that they're doing it wrong because they're not experiencing in that way of those 5 stages. And so I think that's a challenge too. But once we can talk with people about what grief and mourning looks like, then that's helpful to them.
So you mentioned the stages of grief. What is that concept behind that? And just in case we have audience members who aren't familiar with it, I'm sure most people have heard of it, but what are the misconceptions with that maybe?
So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is someone who did a lot of work with death and dying, and she had written books about it, and she talked about seeing these 5 stages within people who are dying. Not the only thing they had was that denial and anger and bargaining and depression and then acceptance. Those 5 things were pulled out of kind of what she saw with dying people, and was put on that bereavement side of things for those people who were grieving someone who had died. And we really have more contemporary ways of looking at that now, what mourning, the process involves. And so there's other theories, and we talk about those with our clients to help them understand that what they're going through makes sense, and that there are ways to support their coping that has been overwhelmed by the death and what they're experiencing.
Wonderful. And I think we have an audience question that popped up. So Hannah, if you'd like to ask that for Holly.
Yeah, so an audience member would like to know if men typically shy away from coming in for counseling, and what you would say to them if that's the case.
Yeah, I think there are some stereotypes and some kind of social norms still with how we look at gender, even though there is a continuum of what people experience. And so we used to actually in the field say people were grieving either in a masculine way or a feminine way, and we've moved away from that and don't say that anymore. And people experience grief sometimes more where they're really comfortable with emoting and sharing their emotions, and other people who aren't comfortable sharing emotions, maybe they don't cry, but they're really grieving through what they're thinking and processing through thought and behavior. And so sometimes people look at people who grieve in that way, and there are men who grieve in that way, and they think they're not grieving. And the men think they're not grieving. And there are still those messages of kind of don't cry, suck it up. And so I think there can still be that tendency of men to be seen as grieving, not grieving because they're not crying, they're not emoting. But sometimes they are, it just looks different. And there are women too who are more instrumental grievers, where it's more in their thought and in their behavior. I think the message I would give to anyone, if you are grieving the death of someone and you are struggling with functioning in your day-to-day life, with going to work, with taking care of things that you need to take care of, it is okay to ask for help. It doesn't mean you're weak. It really is an indication of the impact that this person had on your life. And right now with COVID, our usual social support is not as readily accessible. We're not getting that physical reassurance with hugs and being able to be with people who are important with us, who support us and can help us. And so I think even more so now, reaching out for help if you are struggling is important to do. Even though it's hard, it's important to do.
I think that that's a great point. There's ways that you might think that you can plan for your grief and fit it in to your life. Oh, I'll be sad before work, but when I get to work, I'll be fine. And when I get home, I can feel sad, but not while I'm at work or while I'm making dinner. I have things that I have to do. So I think that that's a great message to be able to tell our audience members that there's no linear way to look at grief, and you can't really compartmentalize it in an effective way. With that, just like I suspected, we were popular in the comment section today. Keep them coming. Hannah, if you'd like to pop on and ask the next question.
Yeah, Holly, so we have an audience member, you talked about adults and men versus women and things like that. This audience member would like to know, how do you explain grief to a small child? She is saying around 4 or 5 years old. What would your advice be for that?
So I guess the main message is that children grieve no matter their age. So even very young children, toddlers, even infants experience the change, the stress that the adults in their life are feeling, even though they have no way to process that. But they know that someone is stressed out. And so for kids, one thing that can be really helpful is to keep structure as much as you can. Keep the structure the same, routine the same. That can be reassuring and helpful to them. With respect to words to use with kids, it really, I tell adults that your child the best, and kind of their language, their level of understanding, because development is, it kind of is really specific to that child. So, but someone who's 4 tends to not understand that death is permanent. So they might, you might tell them, grandma has died. And depending on your belief system, if you have a belief about what happens after death, you might use some of that language. For some of our families, they might say grandma's in heaven. And then the next day, the 4-year-old might ask again, where's grandma? Is she coming to my to dinner tonight? And you don't understand why she's asking again. Kids at some point in their development, they learn that death is permanent, but at that age, they don't understand that it's permanent. And so they can continue to ask questions. And it can be hard for adults who are grieving to keep saying it, but I encourage you, it's kind of their way of processing. And also to not use, it's helpful to be very clear, and that, grandma has died, that her, she's not, her brain isn't working, her heart isn't pumping, she's not breathing anymore, and that her body's not working. If we say grandma is resting, and that might create some anxiety, then when you say, I'm going to go rest for a little while and go take a nap, and then for a 4-year-old to not understand that you're talking about rest like a nap, but that's what you said grandma's doing. And so to be very careful and be clear with language, and then just know that you might need to continue with reassurance and verbally have to answer questions multiple times.
Wow, I think that that's a great piece to say, especially with the language. I think all across the US and, not just in Indiana where we are, language varies greatly. So using very specific language in the area that you're at can be beneficial. Now, is that something that might, through the process as a parent going through grief, I can imagine that might be difficult, or is that helpful to have a child to be able to say, repeatedly, they're gone, they've passed, they passed?
I think, of course, for a kid who doesn't quite understand permanence and is asking because they just don't get it, and so they keep asking about that person. I think for them, it's just their process. So I don't know that if they're asking, then it means that they're needing that information. I think it can be really hard for adults when they're grieving to have that continued reminder and to have to say that over and over again, because that hurts. And so that can be challenging. I know we often will talk with families just over the phone. They might call and say, we've experienced a death and we have a 4-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old, and what makes sense to talk, how do we talk with them? And we can provide resources and more information, because I know we have limited time today, but we do have information that we can share, either send it to you by email or talk with you over the phone, to some book lists that might be helpful if your child likes to read, that can give more information and help guide you in how to educate your child.
I think that that's wonderful. And the piece about more information, to our community members, understand that no one is all knowing, but having this hubbub of information, you're already on our page, you're seeing all of this all encompassing end of life information, it can be overwhelming. So reaching out to individuals in whatever specific field that you have more questions in can be extremely helpful. So we appreciate, Holly, you offering that resource, and to all of our past panelists as well. It looks like we have another question. So Hannah, take it away.
So you mentioned, Elleah, that language differs from state to state. One of our guests wants to know, Holly, do you find that different cultures grieve differently?
I think that is one of the really important pieces of the work that we do, is we really meet people where they're at. And grief impacts our whole being. So it impacts us emotionally, it impacts how our brain is functioning as we're grieving. We can have physical grief reactions. We can also have spiritual grief reactions. And so it's important to talk with individuals who come in, what is important to them, what are their beliefs, and to help encourage them if they're having questions about beliefs that maybe they've felt strong in their whole life, and then they experience a death and they start having questions about it, and talk about ways to cope with that, whether it's speaking to a leader in their faith belief system, in their faith community, and to have someone to talk about that with. But there are different rituals based on belief systems and religions and different cultures. And again, COVID has really impacted that and been really challenging for communities who usually get together or do rituals as a community. And that's been really hard lately, because they've not been able to, or it's had to be modified, or fewer people attend.
Yeah, I think we've all seen COVID impact us in different ways, but especially in that grief process and the social aspect that you mentioned earlier. Going right along the lines of that, can you talk a little bit about how you've worked with some of the families, or how you've talked to families about their end of life issues? Some insight into that.
Yeah, so I think when we're working with families, it's after their loved one has died. And some of the, so we work with our hospice families, and often there has been discussion about end of life care with our patient care staff, and they feel very confident about their caregiving and decisions that were made. But there are times when there's an acute illness or sudden and unexpected death, where our bereaved really question the interventions that were done. Is it what my loved one would have wanted? And they didn't know. They hadn't had those conversations with their loved one about end of life and whether they would want certain interventions if something happened. And so I think then if they didn't have those conversations, that becomes a part of their mourning process of how to cope with either regret or guilt about what was done or what wasn't done. And so we do, as a part of that, then encourage them maybe it would be helpful for you to think through those decisions and talk with your loved ones that this was a process that was really hard and could have been, maybe decreased regret or guilt if they would have had those conversations prior to the death. And again, COVID has really brought that into play for a broader community because it has been something that has impacted young people as well as elderly. But I guess that's something that we've learned through our bereaved, that having those conversations ahead of time can positively impact your bereavement, because then you'll know that that's what they wanted or what they didn't want.
Yeah, and that's a trend that I'm sure anyone who's been watching our end of life series of panel discussions, that conversation starter, addressing this topic, this elephant in the room about loss, grief, planning, any of those things really seems to be a trend that we're seeing. And like we mentioned, resources are linked below to reach out to bereavement, Holly directly, and in past videos as well, that idea of planning, and we're providing some of those resources, and we're going to continue to provide that. But the first step is, I think, Holly, you said it perfectly, that courageous aspect of just beginning that conversation, and planning follows that in whatever capacity the planning needs to be. Transitioning seamlessly over to Hannah, we've got a few more audience questions, so I'll have her take it away on the next two.
So Holly, the first question is there a cost for your services at the Life Transition Center?
I'm very proud to be able to say that no, there's no cost. So it's a part of the hospice model of care to offer bereavement support. And then our agency also has a community bereavement program. So we are able to provide our services to anyone who's grieving the death of someone, and there is no charge for those services. And we are all master's level, licensed in Indiana, specialized in working with people who are grieving.
And Holly, the second question then is, can you explain the difference in coping with anticipatory grief versus grief after a loved one has already died?
I think there's, when we're looking at anticipatory grief, there are losses that happen prior to someone dying, and it is natural and expected to grieve those losses. I think some of the additional parts of anticipatory mourning is that you're grieving losses that you expect to happen. The loss of dreams or time, or, we were just retired and we were planning to travel and that's not going to happen. And that you're doing that along with balancing conflicting demands of caregiving and taking care of things and maybe learning new skills in caregiving. There's just all kinds of those pieces of caregiving that are added on top of the grief that you feel about the losses that are occurring. I think after a death, of course, you're still adjusting to that person and maybe caregiving for another parent or other, children in the home or grandkids. But there's that, you kind of know that person has died and can grieve that. And prior to their death, there's just this kind of, when is it going to happen or how's it going to happen? And that adds to that process, different than after the person has died.
I think that that's great to bring up both aspects about that, especially right after we say that planning is great, and that anticipatory grief, over planning in a sense, can sometimes be emotionally straining and exhausting, right?
Yes. I think exhaustion, if you did a poll of caregivers, that might be one of the top things that they talk about, is how tiring it is. And often caregivers are kind of not paying attention to their own stuff because they're so focused on the person that they're caring for. And so just a little plug that we also need to take care of ourselves, even though that can be hard to do, but it's important.
Wonderful. To just round out this conversation, is there anything else that needs to be addressed? I mean, this is a big topic for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely not something that we're able to fully explain or, handle in a 30-minute segment. But is there anything else that you want to make sure that we really address for our audience members?
I guess that, boy, yeah, it's hard to kind of narrow it down, but I guess one thing is, if you are concerned about yourself or having a hard time grieving the death of someone, it's okay to call and just ask for information. We can set up an appointment to just kind of talk, or you can learn about our services. Of course, we can do that over the phone or through email as well. But it's okay to just ask. You don't have to agree to more sessions, but just learn about it. And I think talking with your loved ones about what's important to you at end of life is such a gift to them. Knowing how that can impact people after a death, and that if you are open and talk with them about that will be helpful to them in their bereavement. And I guess, so that's another message, is to encourage people to talk about it.
Well, and what a wonderful message to kind of round out this session. The next panel discussion that we're going to have will feature Steve Chupp, who is a part of Honoring Choices for our community members. You might be familiar with his face. He's been on these panels before, but he's going to be specifically talking about the next steps after those conversations and advanced care directives. And Holly, that's a little bit of what you alluded to, of the planning and that gift aspect. And I think that was beautifully said, that planning can really be a gift.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, for anybody that's watching now or in the future, a lot of information is going to be posted below to be able to reach out. Holly addressed so many things today that we really do appreciate. And I think with that, I'm going to say thank you for joining us for another panel discussion. And I'm sure you'll see Holly's face in a future one as well.
Thank you for having me.